1851 Maryland. A November morning thick with cold air, fog rising from the Chester River, smoke curling from chimneys of the big house on the hill. The trees are bare now, skeletal arms stretched against a grey sky. The ground crunches with frost beneath boots and bare feet alike. The land is restless. The people on it more restless still. It is the day of a wedding. The Harwood plantation is alive with preparation. Carriages roll up the muddy lane, wheels splattering the soil where enslaved men and women bend to their morning tasks. The house looms white and proud, its columns tall as guardians, its windows catching what little light the pale sun gives. Inside, candles already burn, chandeliers polished, silverware gleaming. Everything must be perfect. Perfect for them. Not for Dinah. Dinah moves in the shadows of the kitchen, a small woman, 5'3", her hair tied back with a rag, her hands red from lye water and soap. She is 24, though her back bends like a woman twice her age. Her skin carries the marks of rope and rod, scars like rivers winding across her arms. Her eyes are dark, heavy with silence. She does not laugh with the others. She does not sing, she remembers. Dinah, that is the name they gave her. She once had another, whispered by her mother in a tongue too dangerous to speak in daylight. But Dinah is what they call her now. Dinah who scrubs the linens. Dinah who polishes the forks. Dinah who knows the kitchen like a battlefield. The Harwood wedding is no small affair. Hannah Harwood, 19 years old, pale as milk, cheeks flushed with youth and vanity. She will marry Thomas Gaines, 22, heir to 2 plantations, proud and cruel in equal measure. Together they will unite wealth and land, blood and power. Together they will secure the line that has broken so many others. Guests arrive by the hour. Names spoken with reverence. Captain Harwood, stern and red-faced, his boots polished to a mirror. Mistress Lydia Gaines, draped in velvet, fingers heavy with rings. Cousins and uncles, young men who laugh too loudly, women who sneer behind fans. They step onto the wide porch with the confidence of people who believe the world belongs to them, and in a way it does. But there is another world. The cabins by the tree line, the smoke rising from small fires, the voices hushed, the children watched, the old ones remembering. They know what this wedding means. More mouths to feed, more whips to fall, more years of labor stretching out like endless rows of tobacco. Dinah walks between these worlds. She carries trays into the hall, head lowered, voice silent. She carries pots back to the kitchen, where the air is thick with steam and the smell of roasting goose. Her fingers tremble only when no one is watching. Not from fear, from resolve. Because this is not just a wedding day. This is the day she has chosen. She remembers the powder hidden beneath cloth. Ground roots, bitter seeds crushed careful in the dead of night. She remembers how it smells, sharp, earthy, dangerous. She remembers Samuel, her brother, beaten until his ribs broke and left to die in the cane. She remembers Ruth, her mother, whipped until her legs no longer carried her. She remembers Isaac, her love, sold south to Louisiana, his voice fading as the wagon rolled away. She remembers. She remembers. She remembers. Every step she takes into the great hall, she sees their faces. Every tray she carries, she hears their voices. The great house is alive with music. Fiddles tune, boughs scrape. The sound of laughter rises above the clink of glasses. The smell of wine fills the air, rich and heavy. The fireplace roars, throwing shadows across the satin gowns and polished boots. It is a night of joy, they believe. But Dinah knows better. She does not cry. She just waits. The goose is carved. The almonds are sugared. The wine is poured. And Dinah stirs. Her hand does not shake as the powder slips into the food, vanishing beneath sweetness and spice. The spoon turns, the broth thickens, the secret hides. The kitchen is loud with orders. Faster, girl. Watch the plates. Careful with the china! The overseer's eyes flick toward her, suspicious. Always suspicious. But Dinah's face is calm. She has practiced that calm her whole life. Her mask she wears better than any satin veil. The hall fills with guests. Anna Harwood sits at the head, her white gown spilling over the chair, her hand resting on Thomas Gaines's arm. He laughs, throws back his head, drinks deep from the silver cup. He is the heir, the chosen, the one who will carry on the lash, but not for long. The first cough will come with the fiddles, the second with the cutting of the cake. By the time the last fork is raised, the poison will already be inside them. Dinah knows. She is measured, prepared, prayed not for forgiveness but for accuracy. One for Samuel, one for Ruth, one for Isaac, one for every name, every scar, every lash. The hall glitters. The guests smile. The music swells and Dinah waits. The night is long. The air heavy with fire and perfume. The smell of roasted meat, of wine, of sugared almonds. Outside, the November wind lashes the shutters, carrying the sound of distant dogs. But inside, the world is warm and shining. They call it a wedding. But Dinah calls it something else. She calls it memory. She calls it justice. She calls it the beginning. The Harwood house has never been so proud, never so bright, never so doomed. Because when the poison begins to move through the room, when the laughter falters, when the screams rise, this house will remember Dinah, and history will remember her too. Before the music, before the satin, before the poisoned feast, there was pain. Dinah did not wake up one morning and decide to burn a bloodline. No, it was built into her, carved with each lash, sealed with each betrayal. Her story was a slow fire, smoldering for years, until the night it finally caught. Her mother's name was Ruth. Ruth was strong, taller than Dinah, skin the color of earth after rain, eyes always searching the horizon. Ruth had once whispered songs to Dinah in a tongue too old, too dangerous. Songs that told of rivers, of freedom, of home. Ruth worked the fields until her back broke, carried water until her legs trembled, and still she sang, until the day they tied her to the post. Dinah was 12. She watched. The overseer's whip cracked through the air, tearing skin, tearing sound. Ruth did not cry out. She just stared at Dinah, eyes steady, mouth shut. When it was done, Ruth did not walk again. She lived another year, dragging herself to the hearth, whispering songs softer now. And then she was gone. Dinah remembered. Her brother's name was Samuel. Samuel was fire, older by 3 years, taller, quick with his hands, quick with his tongue. He dreamed of running, always running. One day, Dinah, he told her, we'll see a place where no one calls us property. But Samuel's fire burned too bright. He argued with the overseer. He refused to bow. And one day they dragged him to the cane fields. They beat him until the blood ran into the soil. They left him there, chest broken, breath shallow. By dawn, Samuel was still. Dinah remembered. There was Isaac, too. Isaac with the smile. Isaac with hands that built things. Chairs, tools, little carved animals he slipped into Dinah's palm when no one was looking. Isaac who whispered in her ear under the stars, who promised her a future, who made her laugh when laughter felt impossible. Isaac who was sold. One morning the wagon came and Isaac was chained. Louisiana, they said. Good stock. Dinah ran after the wagon until her lungs burned. His face was the last thing she saw, fading in the dust. Dinah remembered. Memory was her inheritance. Not wealth, not land, not freedom. Just memory. Names etched into her like scars. Ruth, Samuel, Isaac. Each a wound. Each a reason. The Harwoods did not care. To them, Dinah was just hands that scrubbed, feet that ran, a back that bent. They promised that if she worked hard, she would be spared the worst. That lie kept her quiet for a time. But lies rot, and the truth was always louder. She remembered winters when the cabins froze, when children coughed through the night. She remembered summers when the fields burned with heat, when sweat stung her eyes until she could not see. She remembered hunger that gnawed, nights when even scraps were too few, and she remembered their laughter. The masters laughing on the porch, wine in their hands, watching bodies bend in the fields. The sound of it was worse than the whip. Dinah's silence became her weapon. She stopped speaking unless spoken to. She stopped singing the songs Ruth had taught. She listened. She learned. She memorized the steps of the house, the places where the silver was kept, the timing of meals. She watched which herbs made the stomach turn, which seeds were bitter, which roots could sicken. She kept it inside her like Samuel's fire, waiting. They said she was obedient. They said she was quiet. They did not see her eyes in the dark burning. The wedding was the promise. A new bloodline, a new chain around her neck, her children's necks, their children's necks. She knew what it meant. Anna Harwood, pale in satin, would one day give orders with the same sharp tongue as her father. Thomas Gaines, drunk with power, would one day hold the whip with the same heavy hand. The feast was not for celebration. It was for chains. Dinah remembered every detail. She remembered the way Ruth's breath rattled in the cabin. She remembered Samuel's blood in the cane. She remembered Isaac's face behind iron bars. She remembered and she planned. The powders were not chance. They were not madness. They were the accumulation of years. Seeds ground in secret, roots stolen from the edge of the fields, bark shaved with careful fingers, each piece hidden, dried, stored. Not for medicine, not for healing. For memory, for reckoning. She whispered the names as she worked. Ruth, Samuel, Isaac. Her lips moved without sound, like a prayer. Not to heaven. Heaven had not answered. To herself, to the memory, to the fire. When they told her to scrub the linens for the wedding, she did. When they told her to polish the forks, she did. When they told her to serve the guests, she did. They thought obedience meant safety. But obedience was cover. Obedience was camouflage. Dinah had stopped hoping. She did not hope for freedom anymore. She did not hope for escape. She did not even hope for life beyond the wedding. She hoped for one thing only, that the poison would work. Because if it did, then memory would not die with her. The Harwood house glittered, but beneath its polish, it stank. Dinah smelled it, the rot of cruelty, the arrogance of wealth. She heard it in their voices, boasting, mocking, careless. She felt it in their eyes, never seeing her as human, only as tool. Her past wounds were not scars. They were maps. They led her here, to this night, to this kitchen, to this feast. She did not cry. She just remembered. And when she stirred the powders into the food, it was not the first time her hands had trembled with memory. It was the last, because the wounds had hardened into purpose, and purpose does not shake. It was not one lash. It was not one order. It was not one stolen night of hunger or one laugh from the porch. No, the breaking point is never a single strike. It is a river swelling after years of rain. It is a dam cracking stone by stone until the whole wall collapses. Dinah's silence had been a dam, and in 1851 the cracks began to show. It started with Anna Harwood, Anna the bride. 19, spoiled sharp as glass, she had grown up watching her father slap servants when the wine was late, listening to her mother curse women in the kitchen. Cruelty was her inheritance. Cruelty was her dowry. She was not satisfied with just obedience. She wanted humiliation. One afternoon in September, 2 months before the wedding, Anna caught Dinah polishing silver. A fork slipped. A faint scratch across the shine. Anna's lips curled. "Dirty hands make dirty silver," she said, her voice cold and sweet. She lifted the fork, struck Dinah across the cheek with it. A line of blood welled. The other women in the kitchen froze. Dinah did not. She held the silver steady, her cheek burning, and looked at the floor. Anna smiled, quiet as always. "Maybe that's why Father keeps you." Dinah did not answer. But inside the crack widened. The second strike came from Thomas Gaines, Thomas the groom. 22, loud, handsome, the kind of man who carried cruelty like a badge. He had a temper that flared quick, and a hand that landed quicker. He walked through the fields as if inspecting cattle. He stopped once where Dinah bent to cut tobacco. He crouched, close enough that she smelled the sourness of whiskey on his breath. "You'll serve at my table soon," he whispered. "Best behave." His hand lingered on her wrist too long, his grip pressing bruises into her skin. Then he laughed, walked on. Dinah did not cry. She just clenched the knife harder. The third came from the overseer, Mr. Pike. Pike, thin and hard as iron, eyes like nails. He had overseen the Harwood fields for 20 years. He knew every weakness, every hesitation. He saw Dinah one night lingering by the edge of the woods. She was not doing anything. Just standing, looking at the trees. He accused her of plotting escape. He tied her to the post, stripped her back, laid the whip across her skin. Not for running, not for theft, for standing. For breathing in a way he did not like. The scars from that night stayed red for weeks. Dinah cleaned the kitchens with blood soaking her dress. That was the moment. The breaking point. Because as the whip fell, as the overseer cursed, as the laughter of the house echoed, Dinah remembered Samuel. She remembered Ruth. She remembered Isaac. She remembered the promise she once whispered to herself, that she would not let their memory rot in silence. The whip fell, and something inside her shifted. It did not break her. It sharpened her. She lay in the cabin that night, her back raw, her breath shallow. Around her the others whispered. They asked if she would be all right. She said nothing. Her silence was heavier than their words. In that silence she counted names: Ruth, Samuel, Isaac. Each name was a lash. Each lash was a vow. The decision did not come with thunder. It came with quiet. The next morning she rose before dawn. She slipped into the kitchen, hands steady despite the pain. She reached for the pouch hidden beneath the hearthstone. The powders, the roots, the bitter seeds. She touched them as one might touch a weapon, a cross, a memory. She held them in her palm, felt their weight. Not heavy, but deadly. The breaking point is when waiting ends. From that day, Dinah stopped waiting. She began watching differently. She memorized which guests would come to the wedding. She noted how many cups would be set, how many plates, how much wine. She counted not just food but lives. She studied the kitchens with new eyes. The stew pots simmering by the fire, too small to touch, they would notice. The wine cask in the corner, too public. But the sauces, the seasonings, the sweets, those could carry memory hidden in sugar, in spice. She tested her powders carefully. A pinch on a rat's crumb. The body stiff by morning. A leaf dropped in water, bitter enough to burn the tongue. She said no words, but her eyes grew darker with each test. The breaking point was not rage. It was precision. She sharpened herself like a blade. Her silence became colder, harder. When Anna called her quiet cow, she said nothing. When Thomas brushed past her, hand heavy on her arm, she did not flinch. When Pike's eyes followed her, she lowered hers. They thought they had broken her. They did not see the fire. At night in the cabin, she whispered names: Ruth, Samuel, Isaac. She whispered another too: Dinah. Not the name they gave her, but the name her mother once sang. A name too dangerous to repeat by daylight. She spoke it in the dark, like a spell, like armor. The wedding became not an event. It became the stage, the reckoning, the place where memory would be poured into cups and lifted to lips. She did not smile. She did not weep. She moved like shadow, hands steady, eyes burning. The breaking point had passed. Now there was only the plan, and the plan would end with silence. Not hers, theirs. The night was heavy. Candles burned. Lantern flames trembled. And in that trembling light they all sat. White-coated men, women in silks, silverware shining under the glow. This was the wedding feast. A long table stretched with polished dishes, crystal glasses clinking, laughter spilling into the hall. But the food before them carried not joy, not blessing, only smoke of death rising unseen. Henry Lawrence sat at the head of the table. Beside him, Madame Charlotte, across William Edward Cousins' kin. Servants moved quietly behind, carrying pitchers and trays, but their faces were still, too still. No smile, no sound. Every dish in their hands was not nourishment. It was a weapon. The first bite was taken. The first sip swallowed. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the revolt of bodies began. A throat tightening, eyes widening, sweat dripping. Edward's fork slipped and clattered to the floor. Charlotte's scream shattered the laughter. William clutched his stomach, breath choking. The table erupted, not in joy, but in agony. Plates lay abandoned as poison crept through their veins. One begged for water. Another tried to rise. But the pitchers were heavy, and in them the poison ran deeper. One by one they faltered. One by one their bodies collapsed. Their breaths came ragged, broken. And the servants, the very ones who once bowed under their cruelty, stood silent, watching. Henry Lawrence's face flushed red. He tried to shout, but his voice strangled in his throat. In his eyes there was terror, the same terror he had once delighted in seeing in others. The world had turned. The master became the victim, and the enslaved, wordless in the shadows, became kings of the night. The poison devoured them. Veins burned, hearts stuttered. Generations of cruelty ended at one table in one feast. This was not a wedding. This was judgment. These were not dishes. These were weapons. That laughter was never laughter. It was only the prelude to screams. By the final hours of night, when the lanterns guttered out, only bodies remained sprawled across the floor. And outside, the enslaved looked at each other. None cheered. None clapped. Silence was their anthem, for they knew this was not joy. This was justice. And that night, 1851 in Maryland, history carved its name. The Poison Feast. The night was heavy. Candles burned. Lantern flames trembled. And in that trembling light they all sat. White-coated men, women in silks, silverware shining under the glow. This was the wedding feast. A long table stretched with polished dishes, crystal glasses clinking, laughter spilling into the hall. But the food before them carried not joy, not blessing, only smoke of death rising unseen. Henry Lawrence sat at the head of the table. Beside him, Madame Charlotte, across William Edward Cousins' kin. Servants moved quietly behind, carrying pitchers and trays, but their faces were still, too still. No smile, no sound. Every dish in their hands was not nourishment. It was a weapon. The first bite was taken. The first sip swallowed. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the revolt of bodies began. A throat tightening, eyes widening, sweat dripping. Edward's fork slipped and clattered to the floor. Charlotte's scream shattered the laughter. William clutched his stomach, breath choking. The table erupted, not in joy, but in agony. Plates lay abandoned as poison crept through their veins. One begged for water. Another tried to rise. But the pitchers were heavy, and in them the poison ran deeper. One by one they faltered. One by one their bodies collapsed. Their breaths came ragged, broken. And the servants, the very ones who once bowed under their cruelty, stood silent, watching. Henry Lawrence's face flushed red. He tried to shout, but his voice strangled in his throat. In his eyes there was terror, the same terror he had once delighted in seeing in others. The world had turned. The master became the victim, and the enslaved, wordless in the shadows, became kings of the night. The poison devoured them. Veins burned, hearts stuttered. Generations of cruelty ended at one table in one feast. This was not a wedding. This was judgment. These were not dishes. These were weapons. That laughter was never laughter. It was only the prelude to screams. By the final hours of night, when the lanterns guttered out, only bodies remained sprawled across the floor. And outside, the enslaved looked at each other. None cheered. None clapped. Silence was their anthem, for they knew this was not joy. This was justice. And that night, 1851 in Maryland, history carved its name, the Poison Feast. Morning came, but it was not a morning of hymns or sunlight. It was a morning of rot. The grand house smelled not of flowers or wine, but of death itself, thick, metallic, and unforgettable. The wedding hall that had shone with laughter was now a crypt. Bodies cold, mouths open, eyes glassy. Silverware still resting where trembling hands had dropped it. The neighbors arrived first. Horses clattered. Carriages lined the dirt road. Word had spread. Something had happened at the Lawrence plantation. At first they thought it was fever, a sudden illness, a curse. But when they entered the hall, when they saw the same twisted expressions carved on every face, they knew this was no accident. This was something done, deliberate, planned. Doctors were called. They bent over the bodies, examined the lips, the tongues, the stiffened limbs. "Poison," one whispered. "This is poison." Another nodded, pale. Not sickness. Not chance. This was given. Fear rippled through the county. If poison could reach a wedding table, if death could creep into golden goblets and silver dishes, then no man's feast was safe. The Lawrence family had been powerful, feared, cruel, and now they were gone in a single night. Entire bloodline broken. The soil of Maryland itself seemed shaken. Suspicion turned quick. Eyes shifted toward the enslaved. They were the ones who cooked. They were the ones who poured, but none confessed. None spoke. And that silence was louder than screams. The masters of the county demanded answers. They searched the quarters. They lashed. They interrogated. But the truth slipped like smoke between their fingers. Some whispered that one woman, Sarah, had mixed the powders in the wine. Others claimed it was Jacob, the quiet man who sharpened tools in the shed. Some swore it was all of them together, bound by one pact, one hunger for vengeance. But no court ever found proof. No jury ever named a single hand. And that was the terror. The guilty were everywhere and nowhere, hidden in plain sight. The Lawrence house never recovered. Its windows boarded, its halls abandoned, the fields left untended. Neighbors rode past quickly, crossing themselves, whispering to their children, "That is where the wedding of death took place. The poison feast. The cursed house. The story grew larger than the truth, but the truth was already larger than life. The enslaved who remained walked lighter. They did not laugh. They did not sing, but they knew the ground had shifted. The old power had cracked. The memory of that night would live longer than any lash, longer than any whip. It would live in whispers, in firelight, in the trembling of a master's hand when he raised a glass at dinner. The afterstorm was not just grief. It was fear. Fear that the tables had truly turned. Fear that history had taken its first sip of revenge. Years passed, seasons turned. But the story of that night, 1851, Maryland, the wedding that became a grave, never faded. It moved like smoke, carried from plantation to plantation, from cabin to cabin, from mouth to mouth. At first whispered in the quarters, then murmured in the fields, then carried into the cities, into the north, into the ears of abolitionists who turned whispers into weapons. They called it the poison feast. Some said it was justice. Others called it horror, but none could deny it was unforgettable. Children grew up hearing it. There was a night, elders would say, when masters fell and servants stood watching. There was a night when laughter turned to screams, when chains rattled no more, when one family's cruelty ended at its own table. The young listened, their eyes wide, their hearts burning with something they could not yet name. Historians tried to erase it. Papers wrote of mysterious illness. Records were scrubbed, names buried under dust. But memory is stronger than paper, and memory does not bow. In every telling, the names returned. Henry Lawrence, Charlotte, Edward, the bloodline that vanished in a single feast. And the unnamed hands, the silent architects of vengeance whose courage left no signature but a story. The house itself rotted. Walls collapsed. Vines grew over brick. The hall where poison was poured became nothing but rubble in the earth. Yet travelers who passed by would point and whisper, "Here, this is where the feast of fire and silence happened." And even now the story reaches us. Not because it was the first act of rebellion, not because it was the last, but because it shows what happens when silence breaks, when pain becomes too heavy, when history itself turns its face toward reckoning. The poison feast was not about food. It was not about a wedding. It was about power, about justice, about memory. When we tell it now in this century, we do not tell it to shock. We tell it to remember, to understand, to carry forward the names of those who had no monuments, no graves, no freedom. Their story is their monument. Their silence is their hymn. And if it chills you, if it lingers in your bones long after these words end, it is because the ground of Maryland still remembers. The soil where laughter turned to screams, where glasses spilled not with wine but with vengeance, where a bloodline ended under candlelight. This was the poison feast. This was the night power fell silent. This was the memory that refused to die. Before we close, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are right now? And don't forget, subscribe to this channel because stories like this, they live as long as we speak them.